The Standard Deviations podcast is a weekly production that looks at money, mind, and meaning, all through a psychological lens. Each week, psychologist and New York Times bestselling author Dr. Daniel Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest, experts in everything from finance to literature to wellness.
When was the last time you splurged on something when you knew it probably conflicted with one of your financial goals, like paying down debt or saving for future fun in retirement? Well, if you do this, you're not alone. It's because of present bias, or to use the psychobabble term, hyperbolic discounting. As humans, we have a tendency to let the immediate rewards of the here and now win out over a desired future reality. To learn more, check out the Cash Stash Dash, a planning tool brought to you by the Guardian Network to see just how much your short-term spends might be impacting your longer-term financial goals. Play today by visiting www.livingconfidently.com/play.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I am joined today in what is a first for the show, another doctor of psychology. So Dr. Joy Lere is here joining me today. She's a psychologist in private practice who was formerly an associate professor at George Washington University and who has held research positions at the Princeton Healthcare System, Children's National Medical Center, and the Department of Defense. So longtime listeners of the show will know that on this show, we talk about much more than money. We talk about money, mind, and meaning. So money will take a bit of a backseat today as Dr. Joy and I focus on matters of larger importance, like how to create a life that matters. So welcome to the show, Dr. Joy.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It is a true privilege to be here this morning.
Okay, so I always like to start by giving the listeners a peek into who you are outside of your professional bio. You just told me you were up all night with a sick kid. It is indeed 4:45 in the morning. So this is the kind of dedication that Joy brings to this conversation. But what's something unique about you that would kind of humanize you to the listening audience there?
Well, I would have to say something you will not find on my CV is this summer, I actually had the opportunity to check skydiving off of my bucket list. And this is maybe reflective of a little bit of kind of who I am as a person. I tend to be a go big or go home kind of individual. I'm a military spouse, and I frequently have had to relocate throughout my life. And, I think a lot of people, this leads them to make a decision about, okay, am I going to stay back and play it safe and anticipate an ending, or am I going to really go all in? And I think that's relationally, that can be in work, that can manifest in a lot of different ways. And I have never been sorry about going all in.
So going big for me is ordering something new at a restaurant, and I'm just sitting here like with my palms sweating, just thinking about skydiving. So good for you. So I have to tell a story. One of my most vivid negative memories of childhood, and maybe you can help me as my new therapist, is when I was in first grade, my class went to a dam, and there was a bridge over the dam that was probably 15 feet wide. I would guess if I were, really thinking about it. But I crawled on my hands and knees across that bridge because I was so scared of heights. And I don't have a paralyzing fear of heights anymore, but you will not catch me skydiving. So good for you. Good for you. You're much braver than I am. And I think, you're being here this early, your zest for life will be apparent as I think we talk about the things that we talk about today. So you and I were introduced by a mutual friend, and we immediately sort of bonded over something that I think is a powerful concept in psychology, but I think something that most people have never heard of. And so the shrink term for this is an existential boundary experience. So existential boundary experience is the term. You've had a couple So could you define the term for us and tell us about how you and your husband have had these existential boundary experiences and what they are and why they can be powerful?
Absolutely. So I would describe this almost as, sometimes we have brushes with realities that remind us about the true brevity of life. And the fact that we really have a finite period of time on this earth. We can sometimes have these experiences in life that really help us become very clear about our why and help us to live with intention, with a real laser focus in a way that can be a real powerful experience. So, as I mentioned, I am a military spouse. Throughout the 12 years my husband and I have been married, he has spent a considerable amount of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we coined a term early on in our marriage called bonus rounds, which really speaks to recognizing that based on his lived experiences, we acknowledge that together we are living on borrowed time. For us, goodbyes have been inevitable, but we recognize that homecomings are never guaranteed. And then when you get a homecoming and the after that accompanies that, you really think about that differently. He had a true defining line in the sand experience that occurred during one of his years in Afghanistan where he lost a very close friend. It was shortly after Christmas in 2013. And he had actually served after his friend was killed, as an escort with the body and his friend's widow, who was also deployed at the time. And I tell you, Danielle, I can vividly remember standing in the cemetery at the United States Air Force Academy. There I was, a 28-year-old, and there was a few feet in front of me a woman standing watching her husband's body being lowered into the ground underneath the flag. And I stood there with tears frozen on my face, just very, very aware in that moment of how easily our situations could have been reversed. And this is one experience that for my husband and I has been a real important part of our why, that has really informed and shaped decision making about how we think about being stewards of then opportunities that have been entrusted to us, knowing that we have the chance to live and have experiences that have been taken abruptly from other people and that just really are not guaranteed. And we really want our careers, our relationships, and our family to honor this legacy, and be worthy of sacrifices that have been made on our behalf.
So an incredibly poignant story, and obviously thank your husband and everyone you come in contact with for their service, because I think that people who serve in the armed forces walk this thin line between life and death. And like you said so poignantly, there will always be goodbyes, but those moments of reunion aren't guaranteed. But to a lesser degree, I think this is present for each one of us every day. I mean, we don't know when we head off to work in the morning if we'll come back that afternoon. I've had a couple of these existential boundary experiences. The one that comes to mind, my sister-in-law passed away from cancer at age 32 about a year and a half ago. And she had been sick for many years, but we thought the cancer was in remission. So one day I'm sitting in my downstairs office. I work out of our home from my office in the basement. So I'm down in my office and I'm very frustrated. I'm trying to model this financial concept in Excel, and I'm not having much luck with it. And I'm frustrated and I'm kind of pulling out my hair and I'm upset and I'm, cursing and getting angry. And my wife walks down and she's crying. And I know just by looking at her immediately, I know that, something's very wrong. And I assume that the cancer has returned because I know that my sister-in-law had a big screen that day. Mm-hmm. In that moment, everything that I had been so worked up about, 10 seconds previously seemed so vanishingly small and stupid. And everything about life made sense. Like I knew in that moment what mattered, what didn't, just the same way that you knew as you stood by that soldier's grave. You knew what mattered, what didn't. You had perfect clarity. But I've found personally that it's also very fleeting. Probably a couple days later, I was back getting angry at my spreadsheets again. So right. How do we take these moments where life sort of reveals itself to us, and how can we hang on to these moments and capture them and live with the kind of purpose that you talk about there?
Absolutely. Well, it's really interesting because if I take my experience standing in that cemetery and then fast forward several years, I had a second, I would say, pretty transformative existential boundary experience that happened when I gave birth to, I have twin 2-year-olds. And I had a very unremarkable first and second trimester, and then the latter stages of my pregnancy and childbirth experience was nothing that you could have read in What to Expect When You Are Expecting. I ended up going into preterm labor and underwent an emergency C-section and delivered 2 tiny 3-pound, 1-ounce miracle humans at 31 weeks and 4 days. The last memories I have of their birth include just screaming for my husband to be allowed into the OR while I was being placed under general anesthesia. And the next clear memory I have is waking up on a ventilator several days later in the ICU, scrawling notes back and forth on a scrap of paper with my husband. And the gaps were filled into me that following my delivery, I had begun to hemorrhage severely and then was returned to the OR. And they really struggled to get the bleeding to stop. They transfused over 30 units of blood. At one point, the OB who was on call that night had gone into the NICU, finding my husband seated between 2 plastic boxes, holding our babies, and explained that they were going to have to do a Hail Mary attempt to stop the bleeding, to do doing a hysterectomy to see if they could make sure that these babies would leave the hospital with their mom. But they weren't optimistic. So there my husband then sat thinking about simultaneously the joy of the miracle of these children, but almost preparing himself, thinking through, okay, where am I going to bury my wife? How am I going to feed these children? How am I going to care for our family? Thankfully, many days and multiple blood transfusions later, I was stabilized. But again, this was another one of these experiences that reminded us that we are really living on bonus rounds and nothing is guaranteed. And to your question, it's very interesting because this year, around the time of the baby's birthday, I was talking with a friend, and I was reflecting on the fact that my life before and after this experience actually didn't look markedly different, which is actually something I was proud of, because I think this was reflective a lot of the work I had done in my life to truly align my life according to professed values and priorities. So I often encourage people even to ask themselves the hypothetical question about whether they would be living differently if they knew they were living on borrowed time. And if they are giving a response that suggests that their life would look a lot different, I challenge them that it's maybe time to start making some changes. Now, certainly this doesn't give someone a pass to engage in foolish, nearsighted, impulsive behavior. But I do really wish that more people could be living their lives with kind of the courage and intentionality that accompanies this kind of an experience. And I think in the day-to-day, just having helpful reminders to zoom out and focus on the big picture can be really, really helpful.
So, it's great because a lot of what we've talked about, tragic loss. We've talked about, near-death experiences and childbirth and sort of the harrowing things that the men and women in the armed forces go through. But if you look at people who have written about these things, people like Irvin Yalom or Viktor Frankl, they would encourage you to do things like to imagine what you want written on your tombstone. And, most of us don't want written on our tombstone, here lies Daniel Crosby. He watched a lot of Netflix. It's a good way to consider, in the absence of going through something tragic, we can all stop and say, hey, life is short. And you don't even, I don't think, have to explicitly consider death, because that's very hard for people to do. My daughter just had her 10th birthday, and it was just kind of this round number birthday was just a wake up call for me to go, oh my gosh, like 10 years old, that went really fast. And in another 10 years, she'll be in college. Life is very short. So whether it's a consideration of the brevity of life, whether it's the loss of a loved one, whether it's just noticing the passage of time, all of these things, whatever it takes to kind of spur you into a consideration of the brevity of life and to ask that question, if it ended today, would I be where I want to be? I think is a powerful thing to consider.
Yes.
Yeah. So part of this living this life that we want to live is having to say no to things. So I've been reading and listening a lot lately about choice overload, and you have all these stories. There's these stories that I think come up again and again about people who learn to successfully say no to things or to streamline their lives. So President Obama and Mark Zuckerberg famously sort of have uniforms that they wear every day so they don't have to spend any time, picking out what to wear. Warren Buffett famously eats the same thing every day, which is like terrible. He eats the McDonald's and like a 64-ounce Coke or something. So can you talk for a moment about why we are so conditioned to say yes? And why you have written and spoken about how saying no is often very powerful.
Absolutely. I am a very firm believer that we would be healthier, people would be far better off financially, and people would be less exhausted and burned out if they practice saying no, both to themselves and to other people more often. Saying no is really powerful because it really creates margin. I encourage people to think about what might happen if you started saying no to the things that you really don't want to do, can't afford to do, and don't have energy for. I think people are often conditioned to say yes because there's a lot of underlying insecurity. There can be a strong desire to please others. And there can be a lot of discomfort as they imagine anticipated responses or reactions from other people if they do set a limit and boundary and say no. I also think another huge factor that drives difficulty in saying no has to do with the difficulties people have with delayed gratification. So often people will give in to the path of least resistance, but by doing this, they're really forfeiting the dividends that can come from long-term discipline of saying no and really prioritizing what matters.
So I feel like a lot of our failure to say no is a form of FOMO, or fear of missing out, right? We think, oh, if I say no to this, what if this is my big break, or what if this, what if I, meet the person I'm supposed to meet here, or something like that. So is there a mental model you use, or a sort of intellectual scaffolding or framework? How can we apply a mental model when we're brought to the crossroads between yes and no to decide what we ought to choose?
I encourage people to start by asking themselves why they are saying yes, and really doing an honest gut check about, are you saying yes out of guilt or obligation? When someone is living a life that is driven by guilt and obligation, they aren't actually living their life. I also then encourage people to ask themselves, is saying yes really putting you closer to a goal that you have? Or is it keeping you farther away from getting you to where you want to be? And because I really believe saying no is a skill, it's a discipline, I encourage people to practice. So looking for small ways to say no to yourself and to other people, and starting to do this in ways that are kind of low stakes so that you can almost build the muscle and become more confident in doing this.
It's a great piece of advice. I think one of the reasons why so many behavioral interventions fail is because we sort of swing for the fences. But, like you said, an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and an object at rest tends to stay at rest. And so if we practice saying no in small ways, low stakes ways, like you said, that makes us, better equipped to be able to say no to more meaningful things that are really not standing, that are really standing in the way of us achieving our goals. Like when I think about my big life goals, and I think about how I spend my days, so little of my time is really focused on the things that matter most to me. And I don't think I'm, unique in that respect. And so it's really a good lesson for us as we start the new year of 2020 to, say just a quick gut check. Does this get me closer to where I want to be? And if not, maybe it's time to take a pass.
Yeah. I really believe that our calendars and our bank accounts say a whole lot more about where our true priorities lie than what we are telling the people in our lives our priorities and values are. So I think being really honest with yourself about that is really important.
Yeah, it's funny. I heard a behavioral scientist talk about this recently at a conference, and he said, if you ask people, do you like dolphins? The average person will go, yeah, I love dolphins. Dolphins are great. And then, he said, well, okay, as a follow-on question, how many documentaries did you watch about dolphins this year? How much time did you spend researching dolphin? And on and on. And he said, look, you don't like dolphins that much. Like, you didn't spend any time. And it's a silly example, but what you said, I think, is illustrative of this, because our behavior speaks volumes about our priorities. We may say we love family. We may say we want to write a book. We may say we want to start a business. But if a year passes and we don't spend, but a fleeting moment working towards bettering our families or starting that business or writing that first chapter, then, how dedicated are we really? So there's a big chasm between words and deeds. And I think that saying no to this cult of busyness that I think has taken over our society is a great way to start to realign. And a good place to start looking, like you said, is in your bank account or on your calendar to see what matters to you. So finally, I would like to talk about something that I was tweeting about recently. I think something that you as a clinical psychologist are going to see all the time. And this is imposter syndrome. So in specific, I tweeted that I wish everyone had the chance that I had formerly and that you have to this day to be a therapist, because it gives you so much more empathy for your own struggles, because you meet successful, likable, high-functioning people who are, simultaneously kind of neurotic and kind of unsure of themselves. And so for me, it gave me this window into how, I'm not that different than other people. So speaking about imposter syndrome, what is it? Why do people have it? Why is it so prevalent in our society? And how do you counsel people to begin to overcome it?
So, imposter syndrome can really be defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist even when someone in their life has evidence of success. So, these individuals may suffer from chronic feelings of self-doubt, a sense of almost intellectual fraudulence that really override any feelings of success or external proof of their competence. So, clientele I serve clinically and in coaching and consultative roles place me behind closed doors with very high achieving individuals who have on the outside experienced top tier success. But I can tell you, being someone who's privy to conversations that these individuals are not having with other people in their lives, that as a group, they tend to share a dirty little secret. That deep down, so many people feel like frauds, like their accomplishments are somehow the result of some serendipitous luck. So, imposter syndrome reflects a belief that you're really inadequate and incompetent, even when there is a lot of evidence that you're quite skilled and successful. And I think what's interesting is that imposter syndrome can manifest in a variety of different ways. So it can look like workaholism. So someone's desire to work, driven by this underlying fear that if they don't, they're going to be found out. Sometimes people with imposter syndrome really have a difficulty with delegation, which is just a recipe for burnout. Sometimes people will really play it safe and engage only in something that they are feeling 100% confident in. Now, this can lead to significant underemployment, because I really believe that you have to be willing to face failure and turn into discomfort in order for someone to really grow. Now, when I'm working with people about how you deal with this, I think first you really have to anchor yourself to evidence for and against the narrative you're telling yourself about your competence. And if you think about it, one way I challenge people is, if you think about your hiring authority or your boss, are you really questioning their ability to judge your ability? So don't insult your boss by thinking that they somehow got it wrong by choosing you. I really encourage people to replace, a question that can underlie imposter syndrome of why me with why not me, and be really honest with themselves about that. And I also encourage people to adopt a mentality of becoming a lifelong student of learning. I want people to get rid of the notion that there's somehow this concept of having arrived. But if you can continually hone your skill set and look for ways to challenge yourself and learn new things from a spirit of curiosity rather than anxiety, there can be a lot of power in that.
I really like that last bit because I've never conceptualized it in those terms, but you really make a point that this whole idea of imposter syndrome relies on a notion of having arrived and kind of a bright line between competence and incompetence, when really it's more of a scale, right? More of sort of a gradation. And if you're intellectually curious, you've never quite arrived, but you're always arriving. And I think that's a powerful way to reframe the conversation. So I have to ask, what I hope is not a mean-spirited question here, but sometimes I talk a lot about overconfidence. I've written a book called "You're Not That Great," and so it strikes me that sometimes the reason you feel like an imposter is because you are an imposter, right? Like. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the reason you feel inadequate is because you are in fact inadequate, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it strikes me as similar to the conversation around shame and guilt, right? So guilt is feeling bad because you ought to feel bad and you did something wrong, and that bad feeling should motivate you to act differently. Whereas shame is sort of this more generalized feeling of guilt that's not really rooted in anything factual. So how can we determine whether or not our imposter syndrome is this pathological variety, or if it's really just a signal that we need to step up our game?
So I think people really have to be able to distinguish between self-doubt and a skill and knowledge deficit. And I think one of the most effective ways to do that is to have feedback from people who you trust, who can really provide a 360-degree view of you, your skills, your abilities, people who don't have a vested interest in anything other than being very honest with you. So if this is a therapist, if this is a coach, if this is a colleague or a supervisor, someone even better, multiple voices that can help you see your blind spots, see the things that you don't necessarily see, but also challenge some of these stories you are telling yourself that maybe are not congruent with what other people are seeing. And I think it's really important that people understand if you are driving hard after achievement and success, you have to continually be operating outside of your comfort zone. So let's begin to frame discomfort as a growth opportunity. But it is very important that people do the internal work necessary to understand and address insecurity and core issues of self-esteem that are likely leading to someone being really limited in their potential for growth.
Yeah, so finding that person, it's not easy, but it's definitely worth it to find that person who is not incentivized to give you feedback one way or the other, right? I mean, it almost can't be a spouse or, someone like that. It needs to be a therapist, a coach, someone who is truly a neutral third party and who wants good things for you, but has a vested interest in telling you the truth. I think that's a powerful thing to consider. So as we close, you will be no stranger to the idea of free association, where I throw out a term or a phrase and you just, give me whatever briefly is on the very top of your head. So here comes the lightning round free association with Dr. Joy. So you've moved around a bit. What's the favorite place you've ever lived?
I have had the privilege of living some fabulous places: St. Paul, Boulder, Princeton, DC. I live outside of Napa right now, but I have to say that spending several years living in the UK was absolutely tremendous. It is hard to beat Saturdays in Cambridge with a cup of coffee, sitting at a library. There are a few places that are more inspiring for me.
So I got back from London, 4 days ago, and I want to go back as well. So I'm with you there. I can second that. So what is the best part of being a therapist?
The best part of being a therapist, I love being able to watch people get really uninhibited about success and wealth, which I think both of those concepts are very multifaceted. But watching people get unstuck and really pursuing the lives that they want to lead is a powerful, powerful thing. It's a privilege to be entrusted with people's stories and to be able to walk alongside of them for whatever period of time it is on their journey. And I love what I do, and it's an honor.
Yeah, it absolutely is a highlight of my own life. So the flip side now, have to invert. What's the toughest part about being a therapist?
Well, there's the part that I like the least, which is kind of the administrative burden of it. But I would also distinguish the heaviest part is, dealing with suicidality, the weight of carrying life and death in your hands is a lot. And again, it goes back to just the honor and responsibility it is for someone to be entrusting their life, their health, that of their family members into your hands. Is something I take really seriously as a clinician.
Absolutely. And so final question, who is an unheralded psychological thinker that you would like more people to be reading, listening to, watching?
Well, I would say as I think back to my clinical training, I was really impacted by the work of Nancy McWilliams. So she's a modern psychoanalytic thinker who really provided a lot of alternatives to DSM diagnostic conventions and focuses more on the importance of understanding how personality structures impact someone's functioning in their life and can really drive a style of intervention. And I really appreciate that a lot.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Dr. Joy, I hope that once people listen to this, I hope that they will take a moment to reflect on whether or not they are living the life that they are meant to live and to make adjustments accordingly. I hope that as part of that endeavor, they will practice saying no in small ways en route to saying no in bigger, more meaningful ways. And then finally, I hope that some people will take your advice on imposter syndrome, get that third-party advice, and begin to view life as a series of learning steps and not as a black and white conversation about competence or incompetence. I'm taking that with me, certainly. If people have liked what you've had to say and they want to learn more about you, where can we find you or contact you?
People can visit my website at joylere.com, so JOYLERE, or my email is drlere@joylere.com.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, and its affiliates, subsidiaries, employees, and agents, including Park Avenue Securities and the Guardian Network. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information participants consider reliable, and Dr. Crosby and Guardian are not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken because of the information provided. Guardian copyright is a registered trademark of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America. All materials are subject to United States copyright laws. Copyright 2020 Guardian. 2020-94484, expiration 02-2022.